you've been keeping up with the Denver Post, finally they did a pretty interesting article on the Department of Corrections and all the interesting people they've let out on the streets to endanger police and other people. But the reason you heard about that was from our investigative reporter at Complete Colorado, Todd Shepherd.
Hey, John, how are you?
I'm okay. You've had a busy month, and you were the first to break some of these stories about the Department of Corrections. So let's set the story first. There's been a real change at the Department of Corrections. There was a real push to lower recidivism rates. Would that be the right way to start it?
It is, and I apologize that we're going to have to use all of these terms, and I'm sure it's going to drive Department of Corrections people nuts, as I'll get them ever so slightly wrong as we use these in a conversational way.
Right.
But you're right, and recidivism essentially is once you've let someone out on parole, you know, that they've committed some sort of violation, whether it's either they've committed a new crime, or they don't necessarily have to commit a new crime. There's, you know, this category called technical violations, where if you just do the technical violation, then, you know, that's warrant enough, or at least it used to be warrant enough to put you back in the who's gal.
I mean, the idea, you're on parole, and if you behave well, you can stay on parole.
Right.
But if you don't follow the rules, we worry that you might break the law, you might commit another crime, so we're putting you back. Parole is, it seems pretty clear. Why is there a push to lower the recidivism rate?
Oh, I think it's always, you know, the forefront of criminal justice reform. I mean, look, things change, and change is inevitable, right? And so you're always looking for the better way to do things. And I don't think you can necessarily fault the Department of Corrections to say we want to find ways that make our parolees more successful. And I think they have tried to do it in this case, but they've done it with some. Things just haven't worked out that well.
You are being kind.
Okay.
One of the ideas of incarceration is dangerous people are taken out of the general public so they cannot commit crimes. That is a big part of this.
Yes.
And when someone is let out and they commit a crime, you got to look at it. What happened on New Year's Eve?
Well, we start with the guy whose name was Calvin Johnson, and back in 2005, 2006, he committed some really, they were acts of vandalism, but they were much more serious than just spray paint tagging, right? He was throwing bricks through plate glass windows of a child care center. And this guy had done, and he was alleged of doing much worse, but he beat the charges. So at any rate, he goes to jail in 2006. He gets let out on parole in September. He is accused of having killed a homeless man on either really close to January 1st, in the late hours of New Year's Eve or the early hours of New Year's Day. But what's interesting,
so the point is, this guy's paroled, and he commits murder on parole.
He is accused of this charge. He has not been acquitted, right? And
allegedly, I mean, put in there very lawyerly, allegedly.
You know, it's worth saying in Calvin Johnson's case, especially because the charges against him in 2005 and 2006 seem to me to be pretty slammed shut. I mean, I think anybody looking at those, just, you know, sort of scanning it, would have said this guy's going in, you know, for life.
All right, so all right, this happens. But you did investigations. You found some records that really seem to indicate this guy shouldn't have been released.
Well, we start off, I think, let me tell the story of what got me interested in those records in the first place. So he's accused of this crime that's either late December 31st or early January 1. On December 17th, there's a meeting before the Joint Judiciary Committee at the General Assembly. I didn't know there was such a joint committee, but there is. So, and the Department of Corrections, they're talking about various things they're doing in the department, and they're talking about some of these parole reforms. The Deputy Director of Parole, a woman named Allison Morgan, she is telling this committee of how well these reforms are working. And then she goes on to say, well, let me give you an example. We have this guy, he's got mental health issues, he lashes out, he's very aggressive, but we put him on parole. He didn't want to do that, but we said, no, you're going to go out there. And once he got out there, he didn't want to do that either. He continued to act out, and then we just kept insisting that he stay out. He bought a tent, and now he's living in an alley behind our Lincoln parole office. Now, all of this to me, I'm not transcribing her anymore, so this is my own thought. All of this to me, this doesn't sound like a success story. This sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
Here's a guy who's unstable, continues to be unstable, but we got him a tent, and he's living in an alley, and see how great our parole system is. And then they hold this person up as?
Well, I mean, they hold him up as a model of how these parole reforms are working, and 2 weeks later, he's accused of this, and he's
Well, when
arrested.
you say a model of the parole system working, that's the actual term. Didn't she call this guy a model parolee?
No, she didn't use those words. And in my reporting, I've tried to be careful to the fact that they never called Calvin Johnson a model parolee, but they certainly held him up as a model of how the reforms could sort of work in a parolee's life, right? Because it wasn't just, well, we put him out on parole. They were talking about how these community managers had come together and all this sort of stuff.
So, we let this guy out. It's a model of how the system works. He killed somebody. And you looked further, and it seems as though there were more red flags that guys like this should never have been let out.
Right. In October, according to these logs that they keep on a parolee, one of his parole officers and parole supervisors claimed that Calvin said, "I should have killed my victims." At this point, they arrested him, and he stayed in Denver jail for 2 weeks, but he never went back for a revocation hearing, which only the parole board can make that final decision. Again, in early December, he went to a urinalysis clinic, and he had a huge explosion there where he threatened people, and he used this very violent, threatening sexual language, said he had a gun, and again, they almost sure and swifted him, and this is one of their This is one of their new policies, where when you do something wrong that's not breaking the law, but you've just technically violated your parole, or you've acted in an inappropriate fashion, they can sure and swiftly put you in jail for 2, 3, or 4 days, sometimes 5. But this is supposed to be like an immediate punishment that sends a strong message to the parolee. They didn't sure and swift him, so he still stays out. But keep in mind, that was December 2nd, John. It was only basically 2 weeks later when the deputy director of parole then goes to the legislature and says, this guy is working out.
This is insane.
Yeah.
I mean, this is somebody who is causing. This guy's allegedly killing somebody, and there are red flag after red flag. We're going to be tight on time. Give me a couple other cases, because this is not a single case. This is all leading one way. Who else is let out?
Well, the big one was an offender named Gerardino Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez is deceased now. He had been sure and swifted 3 times. So 3 different times they basically said, you violated your parole. They put him in 2 days for missing some appointments, 3 days for failing numerous urinalysis tests. So then in late February, he basically gets caught in the act of burglary. He gets in a high-speed chase with the police out in the Highlands. Think about the Highlands. Those are very narrow streets out there, right? Yeah. He gets in speeds of 55, 60 miles an hour. Shots are exchanged between him and Denver police. A Denver police officer named Rachel Ide is wounded in the leg. That's pretty serious stuff. And he is eventually shot and killed. So, but he is another example.
Stop there. So we have one guy who kills somebody on New Year's Eve. We now have another person, and if you go to Complete Colorado, you can see all the reporting. Each one of these guys had a series of red flags that I think any reasonable person says, this guy needs to go back to jail. You have this one shoots a cop and then has killed himself in a shootout with police. Other people could have died. But it still keeps going. The hits keep rolling.
Yeah, one that the Denver Post reported on, and I've got some documentation on, but it's just sort of emblematic of, it's heartbreaking to me in a way. There's this kid in Pueblo. I mean, he's 22. He gets stopped by the Pueblo Police Department, and he says for DWAI, he's sort of swerving, and he says, "Look, I'm on heroin," and they find needles in his car, and he stays out. He does not get his parole revoked, and 2 weeks later he dies of an overdose. It's not always just protecting other members of the public. Sometimes you have to protect these convicts from themselves, and I think DeMonte Shaw Patrick is an example of that.
You got a lot of inside information. There seem to be a lot of frustrations in the Department of Correction, and that there are a lot of good people there who are frustrated because, and tell me if I've got this right, they were overruled. I mean, I've seen some of the documentation you've gotten hold of. There are people out there saying this guy should not be released, this guy should not be released, but they've been overruled.
John, it's been an amazing consolidation of power for the deputy director and the director of parole in the Department of Corrections. Essentially now, parole officers and their supervisors, they just don't have the ability anymore to say this person's going in front of the parole board for a revocation hearing like they used to. Now the final decision for a revocation hearing happens with those two people.
What two people? Let's
the
have some
deputy
names.
director of parole, Allison Morgan, and the director of parole, Melissa Roberts.
Who put them into office? We've got about a minute left.
They're appointees essentially of Rick Ramish, who is an appointee of Governor Hickenlooper, who was appointed after obviously the tragic assassination of Tom Clements.
All right, so these are appointees of an appointee of our governor.
Yes.
Pardon me for having a flashback, but I remember during the campaign there was an interesting ad that Bob Beaupre's campaign put on and then quickly put off, which was, are you safe in your streets? If this guy continues as governor, you might not be. And now we're seeing that people are being shot because he put in people and consolidated power, that everything gets controlled by these two people who are letting bad guys out.
And not only did they sort of absorb power from the frontline parole officers and supervisors, John, they also, by putting more decision making in their hands, they're sort of taking away the universe of people that go in front of the parole board. So in my view, they've also taken some power from the parole board.
What's the solution?
The solution is for the legislature to review, not just the Department of Corrections.
You got to read it all. Thank you. Thank you. Check out CompleteColorado.com for these stories. Check out the Independence Institute at independenceinstitute.org. Tell a friend, and we'll see you next week.